Hi everyone, my name is Herkeph and I have survived for a total of 1000 days in this incredibly stupid hardcore world, so I thought it would be appropriate to publish this video as a compilation of everything that I have gotten done in this world so far. And before you say it, yes, this is a really long video, but if you don't have time to watch the entire thing, please feel free to leave it running in the background as it would help me out tremendously. But without further ado, let's get into it. Hi there everyone. My name is Herkeph, and I've decided to do something incredibly stupid. That thing being creating a brand new hardcore world, but with a twist. And in this new world, I am only allowed to use wooden tools and leather armor, nothing else. After a few world creations to find an interesting seed, I found myself in a mesa biome, right next to a pillager outpost. If this isn't a good sign, I don't know what is. I decided to bolt in and ignore all pillagers, which wasn't a problem at all, since they have worse aim than a drunk stormtrooper. I quickly looted the chest inside and found myself a horn, which I used instantly to establish dominance over some random NPCs. I then noticed that they had 4 scarecrows set up, which is going to be our only way of getting carved pumpkins, and since we actually need carved pumpkins for some farms later on, they're probably one of the most valuable things I can find in this world. Therefore I decided to ignore them and run off. I then ran into a ruined portal and found myself a clock. I then continued exploring in hopes of finding myself a village, but found another ruined nether portal instead. Yay! However, this one actually had obsidian, which is very useful. This is when I decided to chop down my first tree and craft my first tools. I also decided to make myself a boat so I wouldn't have to walk like a peasant. I continued riding my luxury yacht until it became dark, which was when I realized that I may be screwed. I did, however, find myself another pillager outpost, right next to another pillager outpost. I ran up to one of the pillager outposts and stole some of their wool to make a bed. I then remembered that pillagers can't aim and decided to clown on them by stealing their precious carved pumpkins. I ran off and crafted my first bed and slept. A friendly neighborhood cannibal then showed up and kindly informed me that he had been staring at me the entire time I was sleeping. I was flattered and gave him a light spanking and ran off to kill a few animals. I then ran over to the other pillager outpost I saw and decided to let their iron golem out its cage as an epic little prank that went too far. No clickbait. I then killed the iron golem and collected his innards. However, one of the pillagers managed to catch me in the act, but thankfully his crossbow didn't have enough knockback to hit me off the glorious 3-block dirt pillar I had built. After a bit more exploring, I actually managed to find a village. I then decided to kill the iron golem in the village and stole all the food I could get my hands on. I then spent the night killing all the creepers I could see to get my hands on gunpowder, which we would definitely need for rockets once we got our wings. And in the process of killing creepers, I also managed to find a lava pool, which would be our ticket to hell. I constructed the nether portal and placed planks in hopes of it lighting. I took a screenshot of the coordinates for the portal and started looking for a nether fortress, which I found pretty much immediately. Once in the fortress, I collected all the blaze rods I could get my hands on. Once I had collected enough, I bravely decided to retreat in a very heroic fashion. However, the tall spooky men had other plans for me. They rushed after me, eager to share their hypothesis that my mother is homosexual. I said no you and ran off. I made my way back into the overworld and fell asleep in the forest like a true alcoholic, but actually woke up quite early, unlike an alcoholic. I then started my journey back to the village and stumbled upon yet another pillager outpost. I stole the carved pumpkins and the contents of their chest and ran off once again. I made it back to the village I found earlier and decided to give the friendly wildlife a quick bath out of pure goodwill. I then started sorting the item that I actually wanted to keep and which items were disposable, collected some wood and made myself 6 shovels and mined all the clay I could see along the nearby river. I later traded them for emeralds and leveled up the village cleric to get my hands on some ender pearls. Once I had 16 pearls as well as a few stacks of arrows and a bow that I bought off a Fletcher, I decided to go around and spread the love in this world by offering more of the wildlife a refreshing bath during the daytime and gathering the innards of creepers during the night. Now that I was completely ready to take on the end, I started making some final preparations and crafted up some eyes of ender to locate the stronghold. I then realized that I had gone a very long way from spawn, which could potentially come back to haunt me. Nonetheless, I started my walk towards the stronghold, which honestly wasn't as far away from the village as I had thought. I did, however, manage to destroy 5 eyes of ender on my way over. And I noticed when I arrived that the stronghold is precisely below an ocean monument, which could have made this incredibly annoying. I decided to go and try to get some milk to remove my mining fatigue, but stumbled on a desert temple, which I happily looted for potential gunpowder and TNT. Thankfully though, I did manage to find the stronghold slightly to the side of the monument, so I didn't have to deal with the mining fatigue during my great excavation. I managed to find the portal room somewhat quickly and noticed that the frames didn't have a single ender pearl, though luckily I had actually found another pearl in the stronghold chests, meaning I had just enough to activate the portal. I then put a chest down and filled it with all items I didn't need to bring to the end. I crafted 4 axes, set my spawn and jumped into the end. I spawned underground, which allowed me to provide you with the best possible content, that being mining endstone with a wooden pickaxe. Roughly 2 hours or 7,200 seconds later, I emerged at the surface and started taking out all the towers. Then began the exciting gameplay of waiting for the dragon to stop faffing around and descend, to then spank it with a fragile wooden paddle. Eventually, the dragon succumbed to my overcompensating glorified stick and gave me a bunch of green balls. I then immediately bolted to the end gateway to start end raiding. I set my render distance to 32 chunks and changed my FOV to Quake Pro and headed off. And before long, I managed to find myself an end city, though it didn't seem to have a boat, which was rather soul-crushing, though when I got closer, I did see a boat, which restored my will to live for a split second. I pillared up and stole my first elytra of this world and killed some shulkers in hopes of being able to bring some shulker boxes back to the overworld with me. I then proceed to jump straight into the void, thinking I could use the rockets I had grinded for before going to the end, only to realize I hadn't crafted them yet. I did, however, manage to land and craft them. I then went on to end raid and miraculously managed to survive. I then made my way back to the stronghold with the loot and started looking for the library to grab all of the bookshelves I could get my hands on. This allowed me to once again provide you with the thrilling content of slowly breaking blocks, in this case of the bookshelf variety. This time, we're starting off with an incredibly exciting adventure, that being slowly mining blocks with a wooden tool. Once I had stolen all of the books from the first library, I then decided to spend 5 minutes and 20 seconds searching for the second library, which admittedly doesn't sound like a long time, but it felt significantly longer. See, this is running it on 8 times speed. Feels pretty long, right? However, I did manage to find the second library in the end, which meant I could once again provide you with superior content. And once I had emptied the second library of all books and chests, I thought it would be a good idea to steal the cobwebs in the form of string, as it could potentially come in handy at some point. Then when I had completely stuffed my pockets with someone else's belongings, I broke my bed and jumped back into the end to then go back to where I first spawned. I decided to relieve a cow of its milk to remove the mining fatigue I had somehow acquired in the stronghold. I then remembered that I completely ignored the carved pumpkins right by where we spawned, and decided to finally steal them. I then flew to the nearest desert and mined myself some sandstone, as I wanted to use it for my ultimate starter base, which is of course trademarked. This meant that I could check off one of the building materials that I wanted to use for my starter house. The build I had in mind would require sandstone, which we had already found, dark oak, spruce, as well as mangrove wood, which for some reason is incredibly annoying to find, since mangrove swamps seem to be even rarer than a girl flirting with me. Shortly after I had set off to find the fabled swamp, I ran into yet another pillager outpost, which I think is the 5th one I've found in this world. But this one had 8 carved pumpkins, which was absolutely insane. I quickly stole the carved pumpkins as well as their belongings they tried to hide in a chest at the top of their tower. I then realized that in between this episode and last, they had found the aim assist option, so I decided to fly off, and after flying a bit, I realized that I had flown all the way over to the stronghold once again. However, I didn't mind in the slightest, as I realized that there was a mangrove swamp right next to the desert. I then punched the air in front of me with a rocket to convey how excited I was and grabbed a total of 7 seedlings. I then decided to grab myself a few jungle saplings as well, just because I could, and continued my quest to find the saplings I needed for my starter house. The next one we found was the dark oak sapling, which I made sure to grab quite a few for since they only grow with 4 saplings. And not far from the dark oak forest, I ran into some spruce, which completed the collection of saplings we would need in the short term. I fell asleep in the forest once again, like a proper alcoholic, and set off. Now all I had to do was to find somewhere decent to live, and I only had a few requirements there. I wanted to find a village nearby, and it couldn't be a snowy biome, since I prefer not being depressed. It didn't take long before I found a plains biome, which fit all of my requirements, and decided to establish my newfound land and get started with my starter base. Just like everyone else, I decided to start with the basement, and dug out a 9x9 area, which I was planning on being my villager breeder. Digging out the area was of course incredibly fun and exciting to do using unenchanted wooden tools. My area where I live, including me, then lost connection to the internet, which temporarily transformed me to a woman color. Nonetheless, I kept digging, but this time with my fist. You might be wondering why I no longer used a wooden shovel, and the answer is actually quite straightforward. I simply didn't feel like I hated my life quite enough. Eventually I had made a 9x9 hole in the ground going 4 blocks deep, meaning I could finally move on to doing what I had been looking forward to for a long time, placing dirt. I then prepared my basement by adding a water source and tilling the dirt to make farmland. I then planted my potatoes, carrots and saplings and dug out an area which the babies would be transported to soon in the future. I then decided to start luring some unsuspecting civilians into their new permanent home, i.e. my basement. Once the civilians had been transported to their new home, I started work on my starter house, which would be placed on top of the baby makers in my basement. I quickly realized that I had severely underestimated how much materials I would need to build the house and spent the next 2 hours gathering materials and building. Only to be interrupted by a baby that had made its way outside of the system. I added a transportation system to the villager breeder and continued building. And this is the end product of that little montage. It's clearly not done, since it looks like a psycho's apartment inside, but the exterior is pretty much done, and I'm quite content with it. I ran to show it off to my mother, and she promptly informed me that I'm adopted. In between episodes, the baby that rudely interrupted last episode's building montage has grown up to become a proper delinquent sleeping in other people's beds. But never mind him, because we actually have a few things to do now. Since I'm only allowed to use wooden tools, I'm faced with a few handicaps other than my crippling depression. That being that I'm not able to mine for iron, which I will need for a bunch of my future farms. Therefore, we will need to set something up to get us some iron as soon as possible. I ran around my base for a bit and decided on a place for the iron farm to go. The iron farm I'm building is a design from Lazenine and Iron X04. I will link the video I used to build it. However, this design meant that I will once again need to dig out a 9x9 area, which I expected to be just as exciting and thrilling as the last time I did it. Nonetheless, I did get it done eventually and started work on the most annoying part of the farm, digging an additional 3x3 area going down by 30 blocks. I hate my life, since I didn't particularly look forward to digging that massive 3x3 hole with wooden tools. I decided to start work on the villager's setup at the farm first, and this part wasn't very bad at all. Just listen to this upbeat music. Doesn't it seem like I'm happy doing this? But that brief moment of happiness was short-lived, as I then realized that I had procrastinated enough and needed to start work on the 3x3 hole. However, like a miracle, I found another way I could procrastinate. I would dig the 9x9 area 1 block deeper, that way we'd hopefully not have the iron golems spawning outside of it. I know that this makes absolutely no difference, and I'm just being lazy, but it did allow me some time to not work on the 3x3 hole, so I saw it as an absolute win. I ran back into my house and saw that the villager, who I will from now on refer to as Charles, has too few IQ points to make it through my impenetrable door. I laughed at him and ran upstairs to craft a few more shovels. I then finally started working on the 3x3 hole, which was just as great of a time as I had expected. I ended up running back a few times to sleep, only to find Charles fast asleep in my bed, which was rather disturbing, so I didn't feel too bad throwing him out of it. However, he then decided to disrespect me by walking across my stomach in protest of not allowing him to sleep. I then decided that it would make sense to craft up a bunch of tools to keep in a shulker box, so that I wouldn't have to go back and forth to my base. I then continued digging the hole until I hit a dripstone cave. How lovely! This means that this has turned into an adventure that requires a bucket of water and blocks to fill in the walls. I opted for dirt as I am still a lowly peasant. I then continued work on the hole and filled in the walls as I went and using the water to build downwards. I eventually made my way down a bit and decided that I couldn't be bothered making it any deeper, so I filled in the walls with the peasant block and went on with my life. I went back to my house to sleep once again and was greeted at my door by a friendly neighborhood cannibal, wondering if I had heard of their Lord and Savior. I told him no and started building the part of the farm where the chest will go. I then thought it would be nice to have the room be made out of stone, so I started smelting some. As our stone was cooking, I started working on other parts of the farm by placing down fence gates and crafting up some signs. So I then arose to the delightful smell of cooked stone and decided to go back to work on my chest room. However, my two brain cells seemed to have an argument, which caused me to almost fall to my death. I then continued working on my room with the chests as well as building the walls, which would become my water elevators. I went to bed once more and was once again greeted by a friendly neighborhood cannibal. But for some reason, Charles decided to handle the talking this time. I gave him a light spanking, which sent him to the cannibal's lord and savior. I then continued working on the water elevators, as well as the room with our chest. I was then ready to remove the staircase into the 3x3 hole, since we now had a better way of getting up and down. I then did some finishing touches to the farm, and was faced with the new task, transporting villagers. However, this was a very smooth process, since we had a minecart pickup system for our villager breeder, as well as enough rails to transport the villagers to their new haunted house that they'd soon call their home. Or rather, it should have been a very smooth process if my two brain cells didn't decide to try to transport all three villagers at the same time. But eventually, I did manage to get all the villagers into their designated spooky house, meaning the only thing left I had to do was to trap a zombie in a boat that I had placed down. Trapping the zombie was incredibly easy. So I went to bed early that night to place the final buckets of water to have the farm up and running. However, after I had placed down the last bucket of water, I realized that the zombie I had lured down into my villager hole had died. So I then waited until night, once again, to get myself a zombie that doesn't die randomly. I successfully managed to trap my second zombie and went to sleep once more. Upon my return to the farm, I could hear the zombie that I had trapped, but I then came to the horrific realization that the golems can spawn outside of the spawning platform I had built. However, all I had to do was to elevate the ground by 1 block for a small area and kill the golem to get the farm working properly. I then went to FK overnight and woke up to be presented with some major profits. Now that we have our iron sorted for later consumption in the form of hoppers, we will probably want to tackle another issue, that being my mining and digging speed. In order to actually collect materials for my future farms, I will need to be able to get a decent amount of building blocks, which would take forever if I keep using these unenchanted peasant tools. And since we don't actually have many farms to generate emeralds, I will have to cure my villagers before I start trading with them. That way I can unlock the ultimate stonks. However, in order to cure my villagers, I'll need 2 things, those being splash potions of weakness as well as golden apples. Getting the sugar and the spider eye was quite easy and quick, but I unfortunately came to the conclusion that I would probably need to go to the Nether to pick up brown mushrooms. I then decided to build my first Nether portal in our base's vicinity and went through. And whilst I was off to get brown mushrooms in hell, I then remembered that I need gold as well, so I grabbed some. The sneaky ninja of a pig variety then ambushed me from above and almost killed me. However, since I had actually remembered to wear a shield, I did somehow survive. Finding the brown mushrooms wasn't very hard, since they for some reason really like to grow in the Nether. And before long, I returned to the safety of the overworld with my pockets, once again, filled with someone else's belongings. I then rushed home to start brewing the potions for the villagers and made some final preparations for our soon-to-be librarians and lured a zombie into its dedicated spot. However, I got a bit more than I had bargained for and had to kill quite a few zombies, and after some trial and error, I managed to get the zombie into the spot that I had dedicated for him. I then decided to take a quick nap to get rid of all the pesky hoodlums, before going back to the basement where I would keep my villagers. I then started the incredibly fun and engaging task of curing villagers and breaking their workstations until I get something I want. Here's a montage of how that went. Okay, I think we get the drift. The main point is that we are now set up with librarians. Today we're starting off in our small villager trading setup with the exciting task of re-rolling trades, as well as leveling them up to hopefully get even more good trades. My main goal of this episode is to get fully enchanted, because in order for me to actually progress in this world, I'll need some decent tools. And armor will probably help keeping us with staying alive. In order to stay somewhat focused on what's important, I set up a couple signs by our villagers of what enchantments were the top priority, and while re-rolling for different trades, we also made sure to use the lanterns we got to make the house we built somewhat more habitable. I also killed a bunch of squids to hopefully make the leveling of our librarians a bit easier. So far, we have been going about this in a very peasant-like fashion, where we go along a river and mine clay in order to get some emeralds. But at some point, we're going to need a better source. But for now, we'll continue with our peasant ways just to get us started. I then started labeling our librarians, so I won't have to shuffle through them like someone with way too much hubris on Tinder. And as we unlocked more enchantments, I started sorting them so we can keep track of what we need, and started enchanting my armor, so I won't die as easily. The second thing I decided to enchant was a wooden pickaxe of the fortune variety. But unfortunately, I had run out of levels, which was rather problematic. So I went back to trading books with my librarians, as well as re-rolling some trades in hopes of getting enough experience to fully enchant my pickaxe. And after an embarrassingly long time, I had finally made my first fully enchanted pickaxe. Just like any mentally stable adult, I got curious about how fast a wooden pickaxe can mine in a game made for literal children, so I decided to take it out for a spin. This is when I realized that wooden tools can actually insta-mine magma, which is incredibly handy, as we will need it for some other farms. And since I'm a very greedy young man, I decided to also steal some gold from the local wildlife. And in no time, we had managed to get ourselves a full shulker worth of magma. And what's even more impressive is that we got it without breaking our very fragile and overcomplicated stick, But now, since we actually had a really good pickaxe, I thought it would make sense to get another farm up and running. So I started clearing out an area right next to our villages where I was intending to build a sugarcane farm. And this is when my 2 brain cells left me to buy some milk, and I broke my good pickaxe as a result. I then had to get myself another god pick, which I did by trading with my villagers to get the books and experience I needed. However, that horrific loss aside, we will need some redstone for our sugarcane farm, and in order to get redstone, we will need to get some clerics. So I quickly popped into the Nether to pick up a couple blaze rods and converted 4 villagers to zombies. I then came to the realization that I only had 2 golden apples, so 2 of them were sent back to their lord and savior. But even with the 2 deaths, that we can, of course, not blame on anyone, I had managed to get my hands on at least some redstone, which is used instantly on my soon-to-be sugarcane farm. And since we also got some glowstone in the process of leveling up our cleric, I decided to use it to light up the farm. I then continued trading with my villagers and continued working on the farm. As I got more redstone, the design I'm using is based on the mud block. Because the mud block isn't counted as a full block, hoppers are able to pick up any items that are on top of it. However, what I didn't think about was that this design uses a lot of hoppers. So many in fact, that I decided to enchant an axe just to get enough wood. And after a while, the sugarcane farm was finally completed. I then thought it would probably be nice to simply do a bit of cleanup and make things look at least a tiny bit more presentable. I then realized that I still hadn't gotten all of the enchantment trades I wanted and continued re-rolling trades once more. I quickly got tired of doing that, so I procrastinated by expanding our storage space in our house. I then returned to our villager setup with a new and refreshed hatred for my life and realized that I will need to cure even more librarians to get all the enchantments we need. So I started brewing up another batch of potions and went to the Nether again to collect some gold. I then started converting villagers once more and spent even more time rerolling trades. And in between leveling up my librarians and rerolling trades, I decided to start using some bookshelves to make our base's interior look a bit better. I also added a few dark oak trapdoors, as well as some pots to make it look even more homely. And eventually, we had gotten all of the enchantments we needed to fully enchant our leather helmet, so I popped into the Nether for some quartz mining to apply all of our enchantments. I then got challenged to a 1 vs 1 by an angry moaning cloud, which made me realize that I am indeed boosted. Nevertheless, I spent some time mining quartz to get some levels. I then made my way back to the safety of the overworld and decided to get myself a fully enchanted sword as well. However, the last enchantment I wanted to apply to my sword cost 33 levels, which was rather steep, so I decided to go back to decorating my house with some flowers. Once the house had a somewhat presentable interior, I flew off to find myself some turtles. I then proceeded to kill a few to get some seagrass and bred a couple turtles to get some turtle eggs. And whilst I was out, I seized the opportunity to grab some sandstone as well. I then went back to finish the interior of my house and get a bunch of glass from my villagers, which conveniently got me enough levels to finish enchanting my sword. And after trading some more, I also got my helmet fully enchanted along with all of our other armor. And with all of our fully enchanted armor, I decided it was time to dye it, to make myself look slightly less like an absolute noob. I dyed all of my armor grey to match my personality and a diamond armor trim, just to flex on all the other players in my single player world. Today, we're starting off by looking for an ocean biome close to my base. The reason we're looking for an ocean biome is because in today's episode, we want to build a few farms that will hopefully help us not die like an absolute noob. And in order not to die, we're going to need totems of undying, meaning we're going to need a raid farm, which will also give us a fair amount of emeralds to trade with our villagers with, which is always nice. And eventually, I managed to find an ocean biome that seemed to be large enough for me to construct the farm. So I gathered everything I'll need to construct the farm and lured a villager into my run-down van, which in this case came in the shape of a boat, and headed off to the ocean biome we found. Once I had made my way back to the ocean biome with our kidnapping victim, I started constructing the raid farm. The farm I'm building is pretty simple and not too hard to build. I'll link the tutorial video I used in the description down below. And now that the raid farm is fully set up, I decided to test it out. Luckily, I managed to find a pillager outpost somewhat close to the raid farm, so I lightly spanked one of the captains and went on my merry little way. And I'm delighted to say that the farm is working brilliantly, meaning we now have a source of emeralds, golden babies, as well as experience. And since we now have a good source of experience, I decided to make a bunch of spare tools, as I will most likely end up destroying quite a few due to my monkey ways. This was, of course, incredibly fun and engaging, and the best thing of all is that it didn't take long at all to do. But now that we're done enchanting our spare tools, I decided to go on a mining trip to get myself some deep slate as well as stone. The reason for this is that we're not done building farms yet. No, not at all. Another inconvenience that I've been experiencing in this world is that I constantly need more rockets, as I keep flying around like an absolute knob. Therefore, we're going to need a load of gunpowder. Thankfully, I've managed to find an incredibly efficient gunpowder farm, which I will link the tutorial to in the description. However, even though the farm is really straightforward and efficient, my monkey brain still managed to find a way to mess it up. I did this by sleeping in the bed, which is used in the farm, and when I woke up, I found myself in a bit of a predicament, i.e. got stuck. And since there was no stepbrother to be found in the nearby vicinity, I had to come up with a strategy. So I destroyed the bed underneath me and attempted to place the bed back. This was, however, not possible, as the bed is very slightly taller than a half slab. This made me realize that I may have screwed up worse than I had initially thought, so I decided to fill in the rest of the trapdoors whilst I thought of a way to get the bed back into place without killing my snow golems, which cost me 8 carved pumpkins to make. I then went into a creative world to hopefully find a way to accomplish this, which I did eventually find. All I would have to do was to push all of the bottom blocks up using pistons. This would also push the snow golems up with them, meaning I would be able to put the bed back. Then I would simply need to push all of the blocks back into place. And now that the crisis had successfully been averted, I continued building the farm in peace. I then went to FK for a while and got back to some major profits. I then crafted myself 2 full shulkers of rockets and dyed them to make it official. I then went back to my raid farm to continue the incredibly fun and engaging task of enchanting my spare tools. After that, I spent a bunch of time doing absolutely nothing, since I'm a lazy piece of garbage, but eventually I started preparing for the next farm, which was going to be the gold farm. The reason a gold farm is incredibly important is because it's the only renewable source of obsidian I'll ever have. I then had to do the thing where I break the portal in the Nether and get myself on top of the Nether roof. I then encountered an incredibly clingy zombified piglin who I pushed down the stairs for a laugh. However, after messing about for a while, I did make it onto the Nether roof and started the construction of my gold farm. This farm was incredibly annoying to build. Since it has to be built out of magma, I had to crouch for the entirety of the construction of the spawning platform, which was excruciatingly slow without swift sneak. And in the process of building the spawning platform, I realized that I am an absolute buffoon and managed to build the circle incorrectly. I went back to fix it and finished the spawning platform. Once the gold farm was completed, I started pillaring up to where we were going to keep our piglins for bartering and started constructing our bartering farm. I then spent 4 minutes and 50 seconds struggling to get a piglin into the designated place that I had built for them, which, again, doesn't sound like a very long time, but it definitely felt significantly longer. See? This is running on 8 times speed. This is irrefutable proof that your girlfriend is wrong, and that 5 minutes is a very long time. I then got enough obsidian from the piglin to go back to the overworld, where I crafted some more items that we would need for the storage system of the bartering farm. I then enslaved another piglin and went AFK once again. Today, we're starting off in the Nether, getting ourselves some wither skeleton skulls. The reason we're collecting wither skeleton skulls is because I want to get my hands on a beacon. We're probably going to need a beacon sometime in the future, but in all honesty, I did this simply because I was bored. In the process of procuring myself some wither skeleton skulls, I got myself in a bit of a pickle as I got cornered by a bunch of wither skeletons, which caused me to use my first totem of undying. This means that I could easily have been killed because I got bored. From that near-death experience, I continued spanking the tall, spooky men with my glorified wooden stick until they agreed to give me head. I did, however, manage to get my hands on enough wither skeleton skulls to get myself a beacon. So, I started making my way to the Nether roof in order to cheese the wither. I know it would make for significantly better content to fight the wither legitimately, but I couldn't be bothered. I then realized that I was being a very dumb little boy, as I could just as easily cheese the wither using the portal in the end. So I flew over to my end portal and grabbed myself my first Nether star. I then got the idea that I wanted a horse. I am not entirely sure why I wanted a horse, but here we are. I set up a very caveman-like system to measure a horse's speed and started testing out a few horses, hoping that I would find a really quick one. And after finding a decently speedy horse, I started construction of a very small stables where I would keep my horse. I then continued faffing around by flying to find a swamp, so I could grab myself some slime as well as a few tadpoles, which we may have a use for in the future, but in all honesty, I mainly did this because I was, once again, quite bored. However, whilst looking for a swamp, I happened to stumble upon a mountain with calcite in it, so I decided to collect some, as it's one of the nicer building blocks. I then continued my journey to find a swamp, which was rather successful. I managed to get myself some slime, as well as a couple tadpoles for future use. However, after faffing around and wasting a bunch of time on doing pretty much nothing, I noticed that we're really going to need more shulker boxes quite soon. We haven't actually been end raiding since our first episode, so I decided to go end raiding for a bit. I then quickly realized that it would take ages to get a decent amount of shulker boxes by end raiding, So I got the brilliant idea that I would build a shulker farm, and after a while I managed to find an end city that was located really close to an end gateway and started laying down some rail to transport my deformed kidnapping victim. However, I quickly realized that I didn't have enough rail to actually make it all the way to the end city. So I once again started end raiding, but this time to get my hands on some iron and gold. And eventually, I did manage to get enough rails to make it all the way from the end gateway to the end city I had located. And so, I started transporting my funny-looking kidnapping victims, and started the incredibly annoying part of getting my shulkers to the overworld. This was significantly harder and more annoying than it looked like in the tutorial video I was following. According to the tutorial I checked, a shulker will try to teleport to another block on the same Y level, which simply wasn't the case. So I had to put buttons on every single block that the shulker could apparently teleport to, and this time, I actually succeeded in getting the shulker to the overworld. I then got back to the comfort of my starter house and bought myself a name tag, since I was paranoid that the shulker may despawn. I chose the name Howard since it's got a bald head. One thing that I had completely forgotten was that I spawned in a mesa biome. This means that snow golems won't survive right at my spawn, which is rather problematic since they are required for the farm I'm building. But luckily, there was a colder biome right next to where I spawned, so I didn't have to transport the shulker too far. The farm I decided to build is based on having a bunch of spawning platforms that are right next to nether portals. So in order to build it, I had to AFK at my bartering farm to get enough obsidian. But eventually, I got started building the farm. I then activated the farm when I thought it was completely finished, though I was quickly informed that my IQ is lower than room temperature by a game made for literal children. This caused the farm to lose the shulker that it was supposed to duplicate, so I then had to build a restocking system in order to get the farm working properly. But after a bunch of monkeying around, the farm was finally up and running, so I decided to go AFK overnight at the farm. When I got back, I had over a double chest full of shulker shells, which is definitely more shells than I'll ever need. And now that we have a good amount of shulker boxes, and therefore storage, I decided to build yet another farm. This farm was going to be an AFK, cobblestone farm. The reason I decided on a cobblestone farm was because I was going to need quite a lot to build my new base. That's right, the reason we needed the shulker shells was because we're starting the biggest project in this world so far, which is going to be my new base. Now that doesn't really say much, as the only thing we've built so far is a starter house with a basement. But trust me, we're going to need a fair bit of stone. However, in order to make the cobblestone farm completely AFK, I had to collect a lot of sand in order to get enough TNT to power the farm. And now you might be wondering, why don't I just use a TNT duplicator? That would make your life so much easier. And to that, I respond, because I am very dumb. I then continued building the farm and went AFK once again. And whilst we were waiting to get a bunch of cobblestone, I decided to jump into a creative world to map out the base that I had decided to build. The main structure of the base would be a castle. The reason I decided to build a castle is because I suck at building, especially when it comes to castles. So I wanted to build something that I don't have much experience building in order to keep things interesting. and after a while, I ended up with this footprint of a castle, and started mapping out what I wanted each part of the base to be. My plan for the castle is that it's going to be sitting on top of a floating island over the ocean. This meant that I also had to measure the footprint to know how big of an island I would have to build. I then jumped back into our incredibly stupid, hardcore world and flew off to find a place for us to construct the base. After flying not very far at all, I managed to find a pretty decent spot. So I decided to mark it out with a lovely 1x1 stone pillar. In today's episode, we have one main objective, and that is to complete our biggest project yet, which will be my new base. As I briefly talked about in last week's episode, the base I have in mind is a floating island with a castle on top. The reason I went for such an inconvenient base is because, again, I don't feel like I hate my life quite enough. Nonetheless, I decided to use the replay mod for once to make this build a time-lapse. However, after a while, I realized that I had basically built a mob farm and almost got schooled by a bunch of hoodlums. However, I decided to just sleep and hope to make it out of the time-lapse alive. Okay, that was an incredibly long time lapse, but this is the result of it. As we can see, it's still looking very unfinished and rather plain, so I continued to do a tiny bit more detailing and put down some chests. I then flew back to my starter house to relocate all of the items that I had left there. I then got to the incredibly fun and engaging task of sorting all of my items into different chests in my new storage room. Since the task was so fun and engaging, I decided to take a break and decorate my new storage area by putting up a few walls and a proper ceiling. I also planted a tree in the center of the outside area of the castle. However, the castle still looked very unfinished and a bit plain, so I decided to surround it with a forest of oak trees. And to light everything up, I ran around and placed torches on the trees. That way, we won't get any unwelcome cannibals or calcium boys on my island. And whilst we were mob-proofing the outside of the castle walls, I decided that it might be a good idea to do the same to the roofs of our castle. Since I used mangrove wood for the roofs, I decided that the best way to spawn-proof them was to use mangrove pressure plates. However, this took significantly more time than I had anticipated, since they're really expensive to craft. And with the forest of oak trees added, the castle started looking more finished than it was before. Now, as we have the outside of the castle as well as the roofs mob-proof, the only thing left we have to do is to find a way to light up the inside of the castle walls. Unfortunately, the recording program I was using decided to go out for some milk as I was recording, which corrupted the recording file. But what I decided to do was to put some paths made out of coarse dirt and mud and put in a few fences with lanterns on top. I then started building all of the farms we wanted to have in our base. I decided to start with an iron farm, as we will always need more iron, as it's needed for a bunch of redstone stuff. However, because the island I had built was hollow, I needed to make sure to put a slab everywhere to make sure that iron golems only spawn inside of our spawning platform. The second thing I decided to build in our new base was a villager breeder. This was actually quite straightforward, as all I had to do was to connect a portal in my new base to the nether roof and transport the villagers. The third farm we wanted in our new base was a creeper farm. Yes, I am well aware that we built a fully functioning creeper farm just 2 episodes ago, and that this is a huge waste of carved pumpkins, but I decided to do it anyway, because I am a very silly and dumb little boy. And this time, I actually didn't find a way to mess up building the creeper farm, which I was rather impressed by. However, as I was building our bamboo farm, I noticed that I had forgotten to put a roof on our new creeper farm, which had caused several snow golems to die. So I spawned in a few more snow golems and put a roof on the farm. And after having finished a few farms, I realized that the inside of the island was going to be really ugly, so I decided to have all of the farms feed into the same storage area, which I could decorate slightly. The way I was intending for the farms to feed into the same storage area was by using water streams. However, in order to use water streams, I needed packed or blue ice in order for the items not to get stuck. So I flew over to an ice spike biome and grabbed some. And once I got back to the project at hand, I accidentally let a creeper explode the killing chamber of my creeper farm, which once again proved that my IQ is below that of a tired toddler by a game made for literal children. However, after a bit of trial and error, I did manage to get the water streams in place and working properly. So I started building the chest rooms, which all of the farms was going to feed into. I decided to go for andesite, since I still had a lot from when I was texturing the castle. I then got to the face meltingly action-packed task of curing villagers and breaking their workstation over and over until they give me what I want. However, that task was a tiny bit too intense for me, so I took a break and decided to start a bit of interior decorating of one of my towers. At first, I thought the best way to get up and down was via ladder, but I quickly changed my mind as it looked very ugly, so I decided on a spiral staircase. Since we got the villager breeder up and running, there's also started spawning cats, so I decided to tame one of each variant as they show up in my base. I then realized that my villager breeder seemed to be leaking as I started finding several cases of villager infestations. Since I didn't particularly like having villagers infesting my rooftop, I decided to execute Order 66. And whilst looking for more cat variants in my base, I found yet another villager infestation in one of my towers, so I did the same as last time. Today, we're starting off by connecting our new base that we've built to the nether roof, so that we can actually move out of our starter house completely. But in order to do that, I had to fly over to our old starter house one last time, and whilst we were in the process of linking up our portals, I also decided that it'd probably be a good idea to also give us a way of accessing the nether from the nether roof, so I watched a tutorial of how to break bedrock and got to the task at hand. And after we had successfully broken the bedrock and given us a way to enter the real nether, I decided that it was about time we connected our raid farm to the nether roof as well. That way we wouldn't have to fly for as long as before. And as we all know, I am a very lazy young man. I then remembered that there's still an obvious farm that I had completely forgotten about, since my brain seems to be actively working against me. That farm being a sugarcane farm. So just like the other farms that we built last episode, I built the sugarcane farm inside of the island we built, so we wouldn't have to look at it, since it's kind of ugly. But now that all those little bits and bobs were dealt with, I started work on what we actually want to do this episode. The main objective today is to get ourselves the Swift Sneak enchantment. This means that we'll be going out on an adventure in hopes of finding an ancient city, and since I have the same IQ as an average mouth breather, I decided that the best way to find an ancient city was to simply dig in a straight line until it magically appeared in front of me. I ran with this method until I had exhausted the durability of all of my pickaxes, twice, only taking a break to go back to my raid farm to repair all of my poor pickaxes. However, my streak of doing incredibly stupid things kept going, as I forgot to get rid of my bad omen effect before entering my base again. So I accidentally set off a level 5 raid right in my base. I then had to spend the next 42 minutes and 34 seconds fighting off a bunch of humming grey people in an epic skirmish, which was very inconvenient, since the Ravagers kept destroying my trees. However, eventually, I managed to clear the raid and got to the task of replanting trees that could easily have been avoided if I had sufficient intellect. But with that little distraction aside, I remembered that I am using a computer and that Google exists. So I decided to Google how to find an ancient city and found out that the deep dark biome, which is the biome where ancient cities spawn, are located under biomes with low erosion, meaning mountains. So the only thing I'd have to do was to find a mountainous area and hope that I can find a crevasse leading into an ancient city. So I abandoned my previous strategy and decided to take flight in search of my precious Swift Sneak book. After a bit of exploring, I did manage to find myself a deep dark biome, but unfortunately, this one didn't have an ancient city, meaning I got epically baited by a game made for children. However, I didn't let that dampen my spirit and decided to continue with my newfound strategy of flying into random crevasses by mountainous areas. And eventually, I did manage to find myself an ancient city. I then raided said ancient city in a very heroic and brave way, I breaking a chest and flying away in terror, hoping that Warden wouldn't be mean to me. And after raiding the entirety of the ancient city I found, I started sorting all of our loot whilst listening to my new music disc that I had found. I also took the moment to put one of the Swift sneak books we found on our leather trousers, and whilst doing so, I noticed that we only managed to find one type of armor trim, meaning that we would probably have to find ourselves yet another ancient city. But before heading out for the continuation of our adventure, I decided to go and grab myself some copper. I am not entirely sure why I decided to do that, but here we are. And now you might be wondering how I'll be able to grab copper if I'm only allowed to use wooden tools. And the solution to that little problem is using TNT. I then started making my base a tiny bit more homely by decorating my soon-to-be bedroom at the top of one of my towers. And I also decorated my walls a tiny bit. And after having procrastinated for an embarrassingly long time, I flew off and found myself yet another ancient city. And this one was absolutely huge. So I began doing the exact same thing that I did in the last ancient city, i.e. breaking a chest at a time and flying away in absolute terror. However, even with my somewhat cowardly approach, I was rewarded rather handsomely as I did manage to get my hands on the Silence Armor trim, which is the rarest armor trim in the game. I then flew home and decided to use the Silence Armor trim on my leather armor. I decided to once again go for diamonds for my trim color, just to flex on all the other players here in my single player world. I then finally realized that I had gotten myself the rarest armor trim in the game. So I decided to continue looking for armor trims. But before I set off once again, I decided to change my armor trim color to redstone, as it matches with my base's roof color as well as my cloak. So I then raided a jungle temple, but did unfortunately not find a new armor trim. I then looked up how many armor trims are available in the game, and found that 4 of them are acquired via archaeology. So I spent a very soul-crushingly long time looking for some trail ruins that I could excavate, and after finding it about 10,000 blocks away from my base, I made sure to clear the entirety of it in hopes of getting all of the armor trims I needed. However, once I was done with my great excavation, I realized that I had only gotten 3 out of the available 4, which was rather infuriating. But some good news is that I managed to find a second jungle temple on my way back to my base, which did have a new armor trim for me. And there we have it, the first 1000 days in my incredibly stupid hardcore world. I hope you enjoyed it. Please leave a like and subscribe if you did, and I'll see you in the next one.